So you know that your child is using substances. How do you talk to your child about their substance use in a way that will not make them tune you out? Well, in this video, you'll hear from Sarah Fletcher, the Chief Clinical Officer at Sandstone Care, as she explains how to talk to them in a supportive and a helpful way. Hey, it's Clint with Sandstone Care, where we help teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with substance use, addiction, and mental health conditions. All right, let's get right to it. Sarah, how do you talk to your child about substance use?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to talking to your kids, you always have to come from a place of curiosity and non-judgment. And that can be really, really difficult, especially when you're scared, you're nervous, you've noticed some big mood swing changes or some pulling back from activities that your kid used to enjoy. And with all of that, it's super important to ask questions, be prepared for the answers, and then again, always come from a place of curiosity. I like to really steer clear of why questions, because depending on how we ask them, using the word why can automatically insinuate judgment. And so for me, I like to use questions like, help me understand what's happening, or do you feel comfortable sharing this with me? And then again, staying very calm and very focused and really practicing that reflective listening so your child feels safe in their environment. Because again, substance use automatically, the stigma that comes with it insinuates shame and guilt. And so we really want to remove that stigma, because if your child is brave enough to share about what they're going through, we want to praise them for that. And we want to be really unconditionally supportive, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to get your child the support that they need. And that's also what they're going to experience when they come to a therapeutic environment. And so the more that you can practice just reflective listening, coming from a place of curiosity, and really practicing that piece of understanding what's being shared with you is going to be your best bet in order to really get somewhere.
Okay, so that makes me think about a nuance that I feel like we don't talk about a lot. Because I think about parents will be intentional about the words that they use. So maybe they read a book or they listened to a podcast or watched a video and they said, okay, be curious and don't judge, right? So they try to ask a question to their child, but their tonality is expressing all the judgment that they're not saying in their words, right? So for example, you come to them and you say, help me understand why you would do, right? Like how it is that you did this, right? And can you, in your experience, have you noticed, like working with parents and teens and young adults, how tonality kind of plays a factor in that?
Oh, absolutely. I think tone makes a huge difference, and nonverbals make a huge difference. And
okay, tell me about that.
Yeah, especially when we're in family sessions or we're learning how to communicate with each other, nonverbals can cause a family session to completely turn upside down. The same thing happens when you're curious and you're asking questions about substance use or maybe what's happening or the mood changes that you've experienced with your child. Tone and your nonverbals are likely going to communicate more than what you're actually verbalizing. And so for me, my recommendations are always never, ever address your child when you're frustrated or when you're angry, specific to this situation, because I know that in life, there's naturally going to be disagreements. And to be honest, I think in every healthy family dynamic, disagreements are necessary because we need to be able to express our opinions. We're all different people. However, when we come to learning about substance use or really trying to find an authentic response from our child, it's not going to happen if we're coming to the table with our own frustrations, stress, fear. And those are all really natural responses to substance use disorders. I'm very afraid. I don't know if my kid's going to be okay. I don't know what they're going through. And so for me, my recommendation is always to take the time that you need before you address your child about this and make sure, again, that you're just ready to hear those responses. Because if you're asking really tough questions, you have to be prepared to get really tough answers. And that's, again, where reaching out for support, I always recommend that parents practice their own self-care, receive their own individual therapeutic support, because this is really a family systems process. process. It's not just the child who's struggling. It's an entire family dynamic that's usually struggling in this case.
Okay, this is so fascinating to me. And, you know, for those of you who don't know, I am not a medical professional at all. I am the opposite, but I was an educator and worked with teens and young adults for a long time. And so one of the things you talked about was verbal cues, right? And so are there any telltale signs, verbal cues that parents give off that you said that you were in a situation, you saw how nonverbal communication was the way that kind of made that thing turn upside down? Are there any like telltale signs that are nonverbal cues where you'll see that it will completely change the dynamic?
Absolutely. The main verbal cues, or nonverbal cues, I should say, that I see that really causes a lot of shutdown and disengagement with kids is sighs. So big, long, drawn out sighs, usually stemming from feeling overwhelmed, and eye rolls, lack of eye contact. These things really just naturally, they insinuate shame, right? They insinuate that something's wrong with me. And so, or that you can't handle what I'm sharing with you. The other piece of this is that what I just listed, those are very natural responses. And so it can feel a little out of your element to say, oh my gosh, I need to make sure that I don't sigh during this situation, but it's a way for me to kind of express what I'm going through. And so a lot of times it takes practice. And that's not to say that if you sigh or give an eye roll that the entire situation is blown. I think my recommendation would be that if we start to experience these nonverbal cues, we name them. Say, you know what? I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed by what you just shared with me, and I'm really glad that you felt safe enough to share it with me. And so that's where you can kind of counteract some of those natural nonverbal responses by sharing verbally what is happening for you, because I think that's really practicing being open and honest and human really creates a safe place for your child, your loved one, your friends to really also practice that open communication.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is being aware is super important, and also self-regulation, right, is super important. That if we can focus on how we feel, if we can control how we feel, because really at the end of the day, that's the only thing you can control, right? Like you're really not going to be able to control your child as much as you might want to. Sometimes you're not going to be able to control them, but you can control yourself. And so those are things that we need to focus on before we step into the room with our kids. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yep. I would say that you need to practice your own self-regulation before you're going to enter into a really triggering conversation. Because if you're not regulated and you're not able to at least name when you feel overwhelmed, there's no way that your child or your loved one is going to be able to mirror that for you. And so a lot of times modeling the behavior that we want to see, again, creates that safe place for the person that we're talking to mirror us and be able to bring that behavior back.
So I'm a married guy. I've been married for a little over 10 years now. And one of the things that we figured out pretty early on in our marriage is that when we said two different words, that it would completely change the trajectory of the conversation. And those were always and never, right? So if we were ever talking to each other and we said, you always do this, or you never do that, when we use those really big superlatives to talk to the other person, the other person was almost guaranteed to shut down, right? Are there any other type of, verbal cues or ways that you phrase things that might get in the way of your child being able to hear what you're saying?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because what you actually just described is something called a cognitive distortion. And so that's what we identify in the therapy world as an overgeneralization. And so when we talk about cognitive distortions, there's a list of all sorts of different ways that we can kind of distort the way that we're thinking about something and give it an overgeneralization, right? So again, to your point, you always come home late. Well, Probably not, but it can feel that way when you're in the moment and you're feeling really overwhelmed and you're having feelings of frustration. Of course, it can feel like this always happens. And so my recommendation to families is to, again, try to steer away from those hard all or nothing thinking, right? So this never is going to be the same. It's possible that things will go back to the way that they were. And the other piece that I really try to focus on is really having dialogue and not as much, again, overgeneralizing the words that we use from like always to never, but instead I like to focus on feeling hopeful instead of hopeless. And so that is another cognitive distortion, is that when we're in a really low space, it's really easy to just assume that we're never going to get out of that space. And a lot of times when families come and seek treatment, they are in a really low place and they feel really hopeless. And so instead of really looking at kind of like that all or nothing thinking, I really try to practice a mindset switch of, I'm feeling really hopeless. I feel like I've tried A, B, and C and it hasn't worked. And I recognize that there's other things that we can do. I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes all the sense. Yeah, totally. I love it. If you want to learn more about treatment options for you, your teen, or young adult, then tell us about your situation on a confidential call using the number in the description below, or live chat with us at sandstonecare.com. We'll connect you with the treatment that you need, and if we're not the right fit, we'll get you where you need to go. Be well, and remember that change is possible.